to the Web3 Prof Podcast.
Good afternoon and good evening, everyone. Thanks for being with me here today. I'm with Seb Bunney, who is the author of The Hidden Cost of Money and also the Chief Information Officer at Block Rewards. This is my second episode with Seb, who was on a few months ago, so I appreciate you being with me here today.
Honestly, it's my pleasure. The last conversation we had, I really enjoyed it, and I really just appreciate just kind of the questions you ask and how you show up in life, and so I'm looking forward to chatting. Appreciate
that. That's very generous of you. I feel the same way, and we just had lunch together, and it was great to hang out with you. So let's just think a little bit about the kind of the foundation of what we're going to talk about. We want to kind of touch on two things like economics and its relationship to Bitcoin. Before we get into that, can you just tell us, just to lay a foundation of what is, in your view, what is blockchain? If someone asks you, hey Seb, you talk about Bitcoin, what is blockchain? How would you explain that?
So I would say that when we think about value, we've got the physical world and then we have the digital world. And in the physical world, we use things like tokens. You have coins, you have gold, you have commodities, you've got property. These are all tokens of value. They're physical, tangible things. The problem with this is if we take a token and we make it digital, all of a sudden, if I have a JPEG picture, it's really easy for me to copy and paste that picture. So all of a sudden, you've destroyed its value as scarcity. Value comes from scarcity. So we've got to solve this problem of how do we take a token and move it into the digital realm so that it holds value and we cannot copy and paste that token. So the way we do that in the digital realm is through ledgers. A ledger is how we store value. And what that ledger says is who owns what. And so if I go to send you money, I'm debiting my account and we're crediting your account. So a blockchain is basically just a series of ledgers, and each new block in that chain updates that ledger with various transactions. So anytime if you just look at the most recent block in that blockchain, you're able to get an accurate representation of who owns what. And what's interesting is I could go back through that blockchain, that series of ledgers that have been adjusted over time. And if I try and adjust one of those blocks, the problem is because the block references the past and then future blocks reference that block, by simply trying to adjust one block, it breaks the blockchain. And so you cannot go back and change things that have happened in the past. And so what blockchain has done is created effectively a adaptable ledger that changes over time, but at the same time it is immutable. Immutable being that we cannot go back and change past transactions easily. It is very, very hard, almost impossible as time goes by. So in its simplest form, a blockchain is a way to store value digitally on the internet. And you could say, well, why don't we just have a CSV file or an Excel file that says who owns what? That works if you're a centralized entity. You're Goldman Sachs, you're a TD Bank, you're one of these other entities, but we have to put trust in that entity, and that entity could change the ledger at any time in its favor. Or if it doesn't agree with what you're doing, it could change the amount of currency that you have in that ledger. And so what blockchain has done is blockchain has put that ledger digitally online. Anybody can access that ledger. Anyone can see who owns what. And that ensures that you've distributed trust. There's no centralized entity that's controlling it. And that's effectively what blockchain has done.
I love that you brought up TD Bank. I'm just looking up something here because we trust centralized authority. So why wouldn't we be okay with TD Bank, storing that information? And when we look at a bank like TD Bank, which is a trusted Canadian institution that's expanded into the United States, they just had a massive money laundering case brought to them where the centralized authority, TD Bank in this case, has been accused and found guilty of laundering, enabling money laundering. And the case was... I think that they settled for $3 billion fine. And so people are like, well, the bank does a fine job of keeping a record of this. Why do we need this decentralization on blockchain? Well, because sometimes the central authority is absolutely involved in fraud or all kinds of nefarious activities, and removing the control from that centralized authority might be really, really important. And I think TD Bank, as of like last week, is a really good example of billions of dollars in fines that they have to pay for their interactions in illegal activity.
It's interesting you say that, because I've been with TD Bank since I moved to Canada in 2008, and just last week, I decided I was like, TD Bank no more. So I have just closed my accounts at TD
Yeah,
Bank.
but where do you go? Like, is there a better one?
Well, this is the thing that's really challenging is at the moment, most of my life exists in the world of Bitcoin. And so I'm using it really just for day-to-day banking to exist in the fiat world to a very basic extent. And so I ended up just like you're looking at credit unions, you're looking at smaller banks that I believe have more of a due diligence to serve their community, and they're not involved on these grand scales, which some of these bigger banks are.
Yeah.
And we've seen it with HSBC, and we've seen it with so many of these big banks. And the one thing that I'll mention is I saw a quote the other day that I enjoyed, which was like, give a man a gun and he can rob a bank. Give a man a bank and he can rob the world. And it's just... It's the reality of the world we live in.
I love that. Okay. I didn't expect us to go down the TD Bank rabbit hole. So when we think about blockchain, that leads us to, of course, a conversation around Bitcoin. So when someone says, what is Bitcoin? How do you answer that question?
So I would say, going back to this whole idea of blockchain, the problem we were trying to solve is how do we take value and make it digital? But not only that, how do we remove that value from a centralized entity that we have to trust and move it into a distributed trust network, one where you don't have to rely on any single entity? And what Bitcoin has done is kind of taken this idea of blockchain technology and kind of extrapolated and create a digital money, a money that we're able to remove from any centralized entities. We no longer have to rely on the US Treasury, or we no longer have to rely on central banks that govern the supply, the various interest rates that can affect the supply of currency, you name it. And so I think when I think about Bitcoin in its simplest term, it is a digital currency that is trustless. You don't have to put trust in any other entity. It is permissionless. You don't need permission to be able to spend your money. It is immutable, which is a word that I was mentioning earlier, where once a transaction takes place, it's almost impossible to reverse that transaction or change that transaction. So we have an accurate representation of what has happened in the past. And that's really important because there's a really interesting, and I highly recommend anyone listening to this, there's a really interesting video on YouTube. Type in Julian Assange describing Bitcoin. And it's in 2014. And what he says is he quotes George Orwell from 1984. And there's a quote in there where he says, "Those who control the present control the past. Those who control the past control the future." If you can rewrite history, you can give a false impression of what has happened, and you can redirect how people think about their lives moving forward. Well, what's interesting with Bitcoin is we have an accurate representation of where money flows in society, and nobody can change that. And so from that, we can make more objective decisions, as opposed to these subjective decisions that have, because of history being rewritten. So I think that's really important. Bitcoin is effectively just a money that separates any centralized entity from the issuance and control of that money.
Okay, that's great. I like that idea around controlling the past, allowing you to then control the future. So in your book, you talk, The Hidden Cost of Money, you speak about this idea that inflation is the invisible tax, or sometimes people say like the silent tax on society. When you think about that and you tie that to our relationship with Bitcoin, are there any drawbacks from that perspective? Is there any hidden costs if we engage in Bitcoin? And how does Bitcoin deal with the challenges we have around inflation in our current economy?
So I would say that if we want to look at the world through the lens of inflation, like a very debt-based economy, there's a huge drawback to using Bitcoin. The drawback is that we can no longer intervene. We can no longer print money. Well, that's a problem. If you've got to meet all these debt obligations because you've borrowed beyond our means, you've borrowed too much money, and you've basically pulled the future forward, what ends up happening is if we cannot meet those obligations, we're going to default. We're going to start to collapse. We're going to feel all of the effects of this default. And so all of a sudden, we're going to have to live well within our means. That can be challenging. Austerity. People don't like going through austerity. So you could say the drawback to using something like Bitcoin is that it prevents us from intervening. However, I would push back on that, and I would say that the reason why we have got to where we are in society is a result of intervening. We have, whenever we've reached a period of stress in the economy, economic pressure, instead of allowing the debt to wipe fiscal irresponsibility clean, instead we have intervened. We've printed money and we've bailed out those that have been fiscally irresponsible. Well, now we've created moral hazard because we've rewarded those that have actually poorly managed their financial responsibilities. Now, what's interesting is there was a podcast I listened to a little while back, and it talks about the 1920s depression in the US. And I was like, I've never heard of the 1920s depression. I know the 1930s depression, the Great Depression, that the whole world kind of really felt immense pressure, unemployment, the stock market collapsed. But supposedly, well, not supposedly, there was a depression in the 1920s and the stock market dropped to a similar extent. There's similar unemployment, but it lasted 1 year. And so then you got to ask the question, why did it only last 1 year? And then the depression in the 1930s, it took 25 years for the stock market to regain its previous all-time highs. And what you find out is the Federal Reserve was not set up to intervene. The Federal Reserve was not set up to bail out these major businesses, to print money. And so when the 1920s depression hit, originally, all of these companies that have been fiscally irresponsible, they borrowed beyond their means, they went under. Now, all of these people, they've basically now just been let loose. They've got no job. They've got to support their family. What are they going to do? Well, they've got an incentive to, I've got to find work. And if there's no jobs out there, I've got to start companies. I've got to start businesses. And so we saw this huge boom that led into the 20s, an immense period of growth and prosperity. And so we saw immense value creation because people immediately responded to the situation they were in. We wiped clean debt, and then we created a whole bunch of value. Whereas from the 1930s, the opposite happened. The economy started to stagnate. We went into a period of like tension, economic turmoil, and then we bailed out companies. So all these companies that led to the economic turmoil were now rewarded. They were not ever they never felt the effects of their actions. And so this drags out the whole situation. And this is why I tend to believe intervention on a grand scale, it misaligns the incentives in society. It rewards poor decision-making, poor behavior.
I think, the misalignment of incentives is, I think, a really important aspect of understanding how the world works today. Because if we have the right incentives drawn out, we will often get the correct results from the situation we're looking at. I mean, I just think about like when I'm raising my kids, like there needs to be an incentive or a disincentive for them to act certain ways. You know, that's why you punish kids when they misbehave, or you have various consequences for their actions. If the consequence isn't great enough, then their actions may not be curbed. And so they need the right incentive to do the right thing sometimes. And so in today's economy, it seems like the central bankers don't have an incentive to, their incentive is to intervene. They're designed to be interventionists. When we look at central banks, they would argue that in order to control the economy, they need to change interest rates and they need to deal with inflation. They need to have control over the economic growth by changing the interest rate. How do central bankers impact our economy in a negative way through the changing of interest rates? And we're seeing this right now as central banks, are generally dropping the interest rates. And how does that impact me in my daily life?
For sure. So I think there's two things. There's money and then there are interest rates. And both of these are measures that give us insight into the stability of an economy. And so if prices are falling, then that means that, hey, there's a ton of supply entering the market and not enough demand. So all of a sudden prices are falling. If interest rates are rising, then what that indicates is, hey, people are very conscious about lending money, maybe because they perceive risk in the economy. So they're not willing to lend at a lower interest rate. They're going to demand a higher interest rate. And so from analyzing money and interest rates, we can gain a lot about the stability of the economy. We can gain whether or not the economy is perceived as risky, whether the economy is perceived safe. And that's really important because you're effectively using money and interest rates as a measure of risk in the economy. Mm-hmm. The challenge is when you have economists that come out and now they artificially set interest rates, it masks that information that we would otherwise glean from interest rates. So when you have, let's take the 1930s depression again. When we start to move into a depression, we're facing immense economic turmoil, the markets start to collapse. Well, what should naturally happen? Well, people are going to be very cautious about lending out money because, man, I don't know what companies are safe, what companies are being fiscally responsible. And so in order for me to lend out my money, I'm going to charge a premium, quite a high interest rate. Well, the moment the central bank steps in and then cuts interest rates, what have you done? All of a sudden, you've now said to all of these companies that have been fiscally irresponsible, that have borrowed beyond their means, you've said, hey, you can borrow more and at a cheaper rate. So they're trying to bail out the economy. They're trying to do something good for the economy, but what you've actually done is exacerbated the situation. And not only that, it's now misaligned this mirror or this port into looking into how the stability of the economy. We now no longer can gain that information. So we've distorted how we view the economy. And so I think that when we intervene, these measures of risk in the economy, which is money, prices, and interest rates, become distorted. And I think that's really, really important to mention those things.
That's great. When we look at inflation, some would argue that inflation is required to redistribute wealth. And there's a perception where, I mean, if I own a house and we have inflation, and my house goes up in value, I'm a richer person. And how do you view that as a negative thing?
I would say that when it comes to, let's take a more capitalist free market approach. In the capitalist free market approach, it is that value and capital flows to where value is being created in society. You can start a business. Let's say you want to start a snowmaking business in the Sahara Desert. Not many people are going to buy your product. No capital is going to flow towards you because you're not creating value. Whereas in Whistler, on a poor snow year, your snowmaking business may be crushing it. And so what that means is the free market is constantly iterating against itself to provide value, because by providing value, you generate capital. And so in a free market, people who have wealth tend to have accumulated wealth because they've offered value to society. The problem with inflation and the problem with intervention is all of a sudden someone has to make that decision on where do we want wealth to flow in society. Where do we want capital to flow in society? What sectors of the economy do we support? And someone's got to make that decision. But if someone is making that decision, they have their own self-interest. And that's the challenge with any interventionistic system, is an interventionistic system relies on people, and people are inherently self-interested. And so instead of relying on someone to make that decision on who should be wealthy and who shouldn't, who should have capital and who shouldn't, we should instead be relying on who is actually offering value in society. And I think that's really important.
That's great. Can I ask you a strange question? If you got to meet Satoshi, or you figured out who Satoshi was, what would you ask him?
Boy, that is put on the spot. I would say...
What would you ask him? Just the most important person in all of our lives. None of us know who he is, who they are, who she is. And you meet him, and you're like, oh, this is Satoshi. What are you going to say? Good to meet you, sir. Thank you for doing the world a great service.
This is a tough one, because I feel like... Okay, you know what? What we were talking about just before we jumped in and recorded this pod, we were having lunch, and I spoke about this idea that what I think is so fascinating about Bitcoin is that although it is money, it gets us to stop thinking about money. If as an individual, our purchasing power is increasing over time, which if it just follows its traditional trajectory, we're going to continue to see our purchasing power appreciate over time, then we have greater capacity as individuals to show up.
Sorry, I just want to clarify. We will see an increasing in purchasing power if we're holding Bitcoin.
Yeah.
Not if we're holding dollars.
So if we're saving in Bitcoin, we're going to see an increase in purchasing power over time, given that, and this is Jeff Booth's thesis, and I don't want to go too deep down a rabbit hole, given that as a society, we're always constantly striving to get more for less. We're trying to increase productivity and efficiency in all of our products and services. So prices should be falling. We just don't realize that because we print too much money. Now, so if we're saving in Bitcoin, we have greater capacity to show up. If we have greater capacity to show up because our purchasing power is increasing, our cost of living is falling, then we can better look inwards and ask ourselves, who am I? How do I want to show up? What is it that I value as an individual? And I think that when we think about money, when we think about finance, we get stuck in these rabbit holes of how do I make more money? What is the best business idea? Well, I just want growth. And so I'd be curious if I was able to sit down with Satoshi. It may not necessarily be one question, but I would just love to know his thoughts on the world and spirituality and how he envisions, what is it that he values? What is it that he wants to kind of contribute to the world? What is it that his original intent was with Bitcoin? I think that would be fascinating.
When you talk like this, I kind of think about the pressures. I don't know the hard stats, but you hear things like, one of the greatest reasons for divorce is because of financial pressure, for example. And you can imagine a world in which someone has saved in Bitcoin and, lives in a world where Bitcoin is central to their life, and that ultimately relieves financial pressure. I guess what you're leading to in this commentary is that would be so good for society. People would be better off in many ways. When you say you would show up more authentically, you wouldn't be necessarily carrying the burden of the financial grief you're going through because everything got way more expensive this year over last year. Rather, you'd be free to focus on maybe things that actually matter. Is that right?
100%. Because I think that when we think about how money impacts us as individuals in our psychological state, how we show up, the challenge right now is, you guys have probably heard of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, this kind of triangle. And at the base of that triangle, you've got your housing, food, basic security needs. You can't think about relationships, you can't think about compassion and altruism, you can't think about self-actualization and more spiritual beliefs until many times we've met our very basic needs, food and shelter. And so I think the challenge with the world at which we live in today is that because our cost of living is constantly rising, it's getting harder and harder to get by, we're constantly having to chase our next paycheck to put food on the table, to support our family. And that's impacting our capacity to really look inwards and deepen our relationship with ourselves, our friends, our community. And so when I think about the financial industry, I think the financial industry is a byproduct of broken money. It's a byproduct of money not allowing us to save, not allowing us to store value effectively. Because if we cannot store our value effectively, we're not going to have to chase investments. And investing and saving are very different things. Saving does not involve risk. Investing involves risk. And people are having to go out and take risk to try and appreciate their purchasing power as a result of our money no longer serving as a store of value.
Have you heard the term financial nihilism before? So I think this is interesting because, maybe 10 months ago or something like that, meme coins really launched aggressively in the market. And we saw such huge growth in meme coins. And there was a lot of questions like, why are meme coins getting so popular? Why are we seeing billion-dollar market caps on something that doesn't even mean anything or hold any value? And one thing that I think people are starting to realize is that because of financial nihilism, this idea that basically I'm never going to be able to own a house, I'm never going to be able to get there, I'm never going to achieve what my parents did, because historically every generation was usually getting better off than their parents, that we are just basically gambling in hopes that we buy the right meme coin so that we can get rich enough to maybe buy a house or afford to live, because of the enormous pressure on the current generations to deal with the fact that they probably won't ever be able to afford a home. So I might as well just go out there and just put it all on black and go to the casino, go to the crypto casino and see how it works out.
I couldn't agree more. And I think that I fully recognize that when it comes to the altcoin space, I'm not going to go and say that there's not going to be a single thing out there that's ever going to produce any value. But what I will say is that the majority of those coins are going to go to zero simply because most people are putting their money into these coins and these meme coins, NFTs, you name it, simply because they realize that through their regular income of $18 an hour, earning $30,000 a year when a house is $600, $700, $1 million, $2 million, they're never going to be able to get ahead. And so therefore people are just like, what's the point?
Yeah.
If I'm not going to be able to get ahead, well, I might as well try and put it all on black and just hope that this thing goes to $1 million. And to your point about kind of the housing and the various generations, at the start of my book, The Hidden Cost of Money, I show this chart that I think is pretty fascinating. And that is that at the average age of 30 for the baby boomer generation, they own something like 35% of the housing market. The millennial generation at the average age of 30, which I think was in 2019, owned 3% of the housing market. It's just like, it's the first generation ever in history to be poorer than their parents.
Right. Yeah. When I was 23 years old, I bought a house. And today, that house is so much, like it's so expensive compared to what I paid for. And it felt expensive to me. But the relationship between my income then and the cost of that house versus most people's income today and the cost of that house is so outlandish. It's just impossible to imagine how anybody could buy most properties unless you do really, really well or have help from your parents or something like that, right? And
then on top of that, you're finding that because people are now seeing house prices appreciate, they create this feedback loop where, okay, house is appreciating, I'm going to store my value in houses. But then they're not going to use the house for its intended purpose, which it offers value to society by putting a roof over people's heads. So all of a sudden, houses have transformed from the utility value which they offer society to an asset. And so all of this money is funneling into real estate. All of this money is funneling into farmland. All of this money is funneling into these things that once offered value to society and are now being taken off the market simply to store value or purchasing power. Now, what is interesting is you look at a place like Whistler, where close to where we live. I used to live in Whistler for many, many years. And Whistler, 61% of houses are empty. They're empty because people are using them to preserve purchasing power. A wealthy individual recognizes, hey, if I've got $3 million, am I going to let it just sit in the bank and rot? Or am I going to store it in real estate and hopefully that real estate will appreciate somewhat?
Yeah.
And it's the same thing with farmland. People are recognizing that farmland is somewhat scarce, so they're buying up farmland, but they're no longer using it to farm, which means it's getting harder for farmers to find farmland. And not only that, but they're not using it to farm, so they're not producing value for society. They're not producing crop. And so I think that this is where when money breaks down, it leads to all of these byproducts. We see the same thing in London. I think there's like 100,000 empty houses in the center of London, and you're just like, this is wild.
What did you say? You said earlier that what was the cost of like a 1-bedroom condo or a basement suite in Whistler?
Oh, so we were talking about rental rates.
Yes. Yes, the rental. Yes.
So like it's very easy to find a place if you're willing to spend $3,000 to $4,000 a month for a little 1-bedroom, and it's just that's mind blowing. Who can afford $3,000 to $4,000 a month for a tiny, tiny, tiny little 1-bedroom?
Yeah.
And so this is where I think that the world is breaking down in that because house prices are skyrocketing, because people are using them as a store of value, all of a sudden, property taxes skyrocket. And then you're also seeing your insurance skyrocket. And then all of the other variable costs associated with your property start skyrocketing. So now the landlords have to charge higher rent. So as rental rates start to rise, you start to basically push people out of their homes. And so I think that as money breaks down, a lot of the challenges we face in society are just becoming more and more exacerbated. And all you have to do is look at, say, like the US average house right now is, I think it's like $600,000 or $700,000 for the average priced house. And compared to the average income, we're looking at like 8 to 9 times the average person's income in the US. Whereas when you look 30, 40 years ago, the average house was only 3 to 4 times. And so house prices are appreciating at a far greater rate than wages.
Yeah, historically, the Royal Bank of Canada would publish a report called the RBC Affordability Index and rank towns on how affordable they are. And affordability was really like generally like a third of your income maximum should go to your housing. And if more than a third of your income is going to your housing, it becomes unaffordable. While in places like we live in Vancouver, which is exceptionally expensive, 100% of your income needs to go to housing, and you still can't even really do it. And obviously that's not sustainable. What are some of the negative psychological effects that we see coming from inflation? And we're kind of touching on this, but if you had to make a list or were to think of like these are some of the top 3 negative things that we see from the unstable money supply and inflation that we deal with.
So I mentioned one of them, but I'll reiterate it again quickly, and that is when money starts breaking down and we start to see our cost of living rising, inflation, what ends up happening is we have to go and work more. And if we're working more, we have less capacity to really question, how do I want to show up? And so this kind of comes into this whole like compassion, altruism, our ability to really figure out who we are and how we want to show up. Because on Maslow's hierarchy of needs, this triangle, we're stuck at the bottom. We cannot move up that triangle because we're stuck trying to meet our food and shelter needs. And so this is leading to depression, anxiety, drug use, because people are simply existing. The next one that I kind of tend to talk about is meaninglessness. People like to be able to plan. People like to have some form of security, have an idea about the trajectory at which they're heading. And so if I want to start saving for a house, I can see, okay, I'm earning this amount of money. This is a house price. If I'm saving X amount, I should be able to reach this by the age of 30, 40, whatever that number is for you. But the challenge today is house prices, when they're appreciating at 5, 10, 15, 20+%, it becomes very hard to plan. And if my wages are not appreciating at the same level, then all of a sudden, 1 year to the next, I can completely lose any sense of clarity about what my future holds. And so today we're seeing a lot of nihilism, this word, I'm just giving up. What's the point? You're seeing a lot of meaninglessness because people can't find meaning because they don't even know how they're going to be able to get ahead in life. They're not able to find purpose because they're simply existing. And so again, like I would say, a breakdown in money as we're seeing these rising costs of living, basically declining purchasing power, is making it very hard for people to plan. When people can't plan, meaningless often sets in. And then the other one that I'll mention is it changes our time preference. Now, Bitcoiners talk a lot about this word time preference. And the way you can think about it is on the spectrum. On one side of the spectrum, you've got a high time preference, which is you want to meet your immediate needs. You want to be impulsive. Whatever you're feeling right now, you're going to do it. Whereas on the other end of the spectrum, we have a low time preference. A low time preference is, you know what, I'm going to think about the future. I want to try and build security and prosperity. And so it's this long term versus this short term. Now, the problem is when money starts breaking down and our cost of living becomes more expensive, well, what is this telling us? If our money is breaking down and things are becoming more expensive, then that means that our purchasing power is greatest in the present moment. So if our purchasing power is greatest in the present moment, it's incentivizing us to consume in the present moment. It's incentivizing us to think in the short term. So all of a sudden, it's actually pushing us, it's pushing us into this high time preference thinking, this short-term mindset, and away from this longer-term thinking, this security and prosperity. And the result of that, what are we seeing? People aren't having kids these days. People aren't thinking about buying property. As I mentioned earlier, the millennial generation owns a tiny fraction of the housing market. And all of this is this short-term time thinking, short-term time preference. People are not thinking about the future. And so just to reiterate those three, it's kind of like it's affecting how we think about the future. It's affecting whether or not we're finding meaning in life. It's affecting whether we have the capacity to give back, have these compassionate, altruistic endeavors. So like these are huge. Money impacts how we show up as individuals.
I think the environmental aspect is interesting. So if money is losing value, is losing purchasing power, we're incentivized to spend it now because it's worth more today than it will be tomorrow. So I buy stuff, and buying stuff and being a consumer has negative effects often on the environment we live in. But the narrative that we constantly hear about around Bitcoin is that Bitcoin mining damages in the environment. It's causing harm to the environment, and that narrative has been disproven over and over again, and certainly is not as prevalent today as it was 3 years ago. However, what we don't hear ever, very rarely do I hear someone say, well, Bitcoin causes you to save more money, which causes you to spend less on consumer goods you don't really need, which at the end of the day is really helpful for the sustainability of the environment we live in. Can you break that down a little bit and also comment, like, why do you think that message is not becoming a narrative? Even within the Bitcoin community, I don't think I really hear people talk about that specific aspect.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that's such a good point you bring up. And I think the first thing I'll mention is that from the critics, many times they're not being intellectually honest about their intention behind why they're saying something. And I think that when the government is pushing this agenda that says Bitcoin is bad for the environment, the reason why they're really pushing it is because Bitcoin threatens the government in that it takes purchasing power away from the government, it takes control away from the government, and it realigns the incentives. Because what I think is so fascinating about Bitcoin is every other asset that we've ever had in history has either been tangible in nature, gold, real estate, cash, and the problem with things that are tangible is that it can easily be seized. And then the other side of the coin is we've got intangible assets, we've got stocks, we've got bonds, we've got cash in the bank, but the problem with those assets is they're held by a third party. That third party is governed by the government, and that government, if it wants to seize our assets, it can do. And we've seen this with the trucker rally during the pandemic, where the government didn't agree with what the protesters were saying, they started to freeze people's bank accounts. So what we see is assets have even been easily seized because they're physical, or they've been easily seized because they're tangible, but they're held by a third party. Well, Bitcoin is intangible, it's digital. We can store 12 words in our head. Nobody has any idea that we're storing that value in our head. I can walk across a border stark naked, and they have no idea that I could have $1 billion in my head. That's profound. We've never had anything like this before. So what that means is it realigns the incentives, because the only way for the government to be able to obtain Bitcoin off its populace is for the populace to voluntarily hand it over. So if the populace have to voluntarily hand it over, well, they have to perceive value from the government. So it really aligns the incentives in that the government has to listen to the populace, because we should be, in theory, we should be the ones that kind of guide and direct the government. The government is just acting on behalf of the populace, not the other way round. And that's the problems that we face today, is that they can fund operations through the debasement of currency. But that's a kind of a roundabout answer to your question, which is Bitcoin mining and like energy usage. And I think that when it comes to Bitcoin mining and energy usage, this whole idea, I think, is so fascinating because, to your point, one of the challenges we face in society today is we have immense amounts of environmental destruction. That environmental destruction is a result of consumerism. We're trying to obtain as much natural resources from our waterways, from our forests, from the minerals from the ground, you name it. And many times we're willing to do that at the expense of the environment. So we've just got massive strip mines in Africa. You've just got huge deforestation, even here in Canada. You've got polluted waterways that are killing a lot of the natural, the habitats. And this is all because as money breaks down and we're incentivized to consume, we're buying up products that are less and less and lesser of quality. And what I think is so fascinating about Bitcoin, and you made this point, is that when Bitcoin appreciates over time, we're now incentivized to save. We've never really had this ever in history. If we're incentivized to save, then all of a sudden we start thinking about long term. If I'm thinking about long term, I'm not going to go and spend my money in the present moment when this $20 could be $60 in 5 years' time. And so if consumption starts to drop, well, all of a sudden, if there's less dollars going to the same amount of producers, those producers have to do something. Those producers that are not offering a quality product are going to wither away, and the producers that are hopefully going to exist. And so it realigns the incentives between the producers and the world, where people start thinking more about the quality of product, the environment, the things that actually provide value to society. And so I think that scarcity in capital flowing towards producers creates immense benefits in society.
One thing that I've noticed living here in Vancouver, and this is probably related to the nature of the place in which we live in, is that because we're surrounded by the environment and it's important to a lot of people, and often a global hub for environmentalists, I don't consider myself an environmentalist, but as you and I were talking today, like both of us love the outdoors. We love exploring nature. We love going into remote parts of our province and seeing the beauty. And to think that I appreciate nature to the degree in which I do, and you as well. But then to also think that I would be the supporter of Bitcoin, which is apparently like destroying the environment, doesn't really make sense to me because I don't see it that way. I don't see that Bitcoin destroys the environment. In fact, I see that it is super useful in its energy usage and maybe supporting local economies and assisting in the development of electric grids and in developing communities around the world. And I often see that with a lot of Bitcoiners. Most Bitcoiners care about the sustainability of the environment, and they care that we're going to move forward in a positive way. And we see Bitcoin as a solution to environmental degradation, not a problem. Whereas the mass media narrative is the exact opposite of that. And it couldn't be more different. It couldn't be more different than the way that most of us view Bitcoin helping the world become a better place from an environmental sustainability perspective.
No, absolutely. And I think that one thing that's really important to step back and ask ourselves is energy usage subjective or objective? And the reality is that I think the media portray it as objective in that Bitcoin energy usage is bad.
Right.
But the reality is energy usage is purely subjective. It is in the eye of the beholder. If I'm willing to contribute my time and energy towards something like Bitcoin, it is because I deem Bitcoin of value. Mm-hmm. And so when someone comes out like the media, the New York Times, and says Bitcoin is bad, Bitcoin wastes energy, what it's really saying is it doesn't agree with what Bitcoin offers and the value it offers to society. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of like saying, if you've got some little old woman who lives in a cabin in the forest and she chops down a tree or two to heat her little wood-burning stove, it's like the New York Times saying we don't agree with that woman chopping down a tree to heat her stove to survive.
Right.
And the reality is that there are many people that rely on Bitcoin globally in developing countries that rely on Bitcoin to store their purchasing power so they can feed their families because their local currency has hyperinflated and it does not serve them. And so Bitcoin to them provides immense value. And the New York Times, by saying Bitcoin does not offer value, Bitcoin wastes energy, is basically dismissing everyone who finds value in Bitcoin.
Yeah, that's great. I like that. In Austrian economics, which is kind of an economic philosophy or theory, we see the emphasis on individual decision making is really important. Like you as an individual should have autonomy to do kind of what you want, and so we believe that individual decision making and a subjective value, like you've spoken about. So how do you view Bitcoin as a store of value when it lacks the tangibility that you spoke about, a couple minutes ago? We have tangibility with gold and silver or dollars. We don't have tangibility with Bitcoin. Is that a negative thing, or is that does that kind of sit in the perspective of, well, it doesn't really matter, it's not relevant?
I think it sits in the kind of that latter. It doesn't really matter and it's not relevant. And that just because something is tangible or intangible, it doesn't necessarily mean that it provides value or doesn't. Mm-hmm. And so I think that we can have an application on a computer that is completely intangible, but it provides immense value. Just look at all the various apps on our phone. We can also have things that are in nature that are immensely abundant, and therefore, because they're abundant, there's really no value to it. I can go pick up a rock outside. It's not really providing me much value, even though it is tangible in nature. Yeah. And so instead, I think it's this idea that value is in the eye of the beholder. Value is purely subjective. If I have a down jacket and I live in, let's say, the Sahara Desert, that down jacket is pretty useless. It's going to cook me. I don't really have a use for it. But if I'm living in Siberia, all of a sudden, that down jacket has a lot more value. And so value is in the eye of the beholder. And I think when I think about Bitcoin, its value is that it's permissionless, as I mentioned. You don't need permission to be able to use it. It's trustless. You don't need to trust in any intermediaries or middlemen. It's immutable. No one can change how much Bitcoin I hold. And so if those properties provide you value, it doesn't matter if it is intangible or tangible in nature.
You're wearing an Arc'teryx hat, and Arc'teryx is a great local brand. You know that hat in China is 3 times as expensive as it is anywhere else in the world. All Arc'teryx products are 3 times more expensive in China than they are anywhere else. And the question is, well, why? Right? And it's not because Chinese people are more into the outdoors and have a higher value for higher quality gear. It's because the image of Arc'teryx is an image of luxury in China, whereas here it's not. I mean, it's certainly expensive, but it's not luxury. And the eye of the beholder says that holds a lot more value because it's prestigious. It's not because of necessarily the quality of the gear, which is interesting because that's a very different perspective than what we would have on a brand like Arc'teryx here.
And it's interesting because I think that you could ask yourself the question, why do they hold these commercial goods in such high value? And I would say that when you look back throughout Chinese history, we've gone through some immense trauma. You've seen Mao and the Great Leap Forward and communism, socialist ideals, you name it, that have created immense struggle in society, and people have had nothing. And so to be able to have materialistic goods is a sign of wealth. And so you could even argue that the reason why we see many of these cultures that have come from nothing pride or put a lot of weight in possessions is because they haven't had it previously. The result of broken money.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. I know a woman who, on her fingernails, she has the Chanel logo put on every one of her fingernails. And I mean, come on. It's a bit absurd, isn't it?
My toenails are painted with the Chanel logo.
I'm sure they are. I assumed you actually would have the Arc'teryx logo on your toenails. Can you imagine? Like that should be something that you should do that. Okay, so in a world where Bitcoin does become a dominant financial institution where people are using it and governments are maybe using it, how do you see governments deal with a disruption in the economy? Because today, when the economy gets bad, the government has tools in which they can deal with it by austerity or by printing money or by raising taxes or by bailing out companies. They have these tools in which they would argue help kind of flatten the madness of the economy. If Bitcoin is their monetary policy, how can they do that type of stuff? Or if they can't, how do they deal with the ebbs and flows of the economy?
So I would start by saying that I think it is naive to think that we can deal with the ebbs and flows of our economy from a centrally managed position. And I'm going to give like 3 different stories that aren't necessarily government related, but I think they kind of tell a story in their own right. The first one is Tom's shoes. People have probably heard of Tom's shoes. There's all kind of like canvas shoes that really blew up in the 2010s, early 2010s. People started buying these Tom shoes and they loved them. Why? Because they did this buy one, give one deal. For every 1 pair of shoes they sold, they gave a pair of shoes to a developing country, a third world country. Now, what was so fascinating is over the course of something like 6 or 7 years that this campaign was active, they gave away 95 million pairs of shoes. Now, on the face of it, that's friggin' amazing. You're supporting all of these small little communities that don't have access to nice Western shoes. What actually happened? 95 million shoes going into these small little communities basically put the shoemaker out of business. So the shoemaker, because everyone was getting free shoes, no one's going to go buy shoes from the shoemaker. So they went out of business. And now the thing with Tom's shoes is after 6 to 8 months, because they're kind of thinner soles, they wear through them. And now those people don't have shoes and they don't have anywhere to buy those shoes. So they become reliant on intervention. And so that's kind of one example. When we intervene, we don't think about the byproducts of that intervention. The next one is, you guys may have heard of like the Yellowstone wolves. Now, people, when was it? I think it was in the 70s, they realized they were just like, man, the wolves, they're killing the deer. So we've got to exterminate the wolves. So they went through on this big campaign. They killed a whole bunch of the wolves, pretty much eradicated the wolves from Yellowstone. But what ended up happening was the deer started chewing on the grasses and started basically multiplying because there was nothing to keep the deer numbers in check. Because the deer numbers started basically multiplying exponentially and they were killing all of the buds, they were killing all of the root systems of the trees, the rivers, the banks didn't have the same root network, the banks started breaking down and the rivers changed the landscape of Yellowstone as a result of basically just removing one thing from this ecosystem. We live in this complex adaptive system, which is our world, our environment, natural ecosystem, even our financial markets. And to think that we can tweak and play around with one or two levers and not have repercussions, I believe is naive. And then the last one I'll give is people have probably heard of Live Aid, the big
concert
that took place in London back in, when was it, in the 70s or the 80s?
I think the 80s, yeah.
In the 80s. And this was all for the famine that was happening in Ethiopia. Now, it raised millions and millions of pounds for Live Aid and countless amounts of food. And so, again, on the surface, this is amazing. You're helping the famine. What we probably usually don't hear about is the fact that at the time in Ethiopia, the famine was a result of poor government because of poor government practices as a result of the communist government that was in power. And all of that funding and food ended up going and supporting the government, which prolonged the famine. And so, again, as a result of intervention, we ended up exacerbating the issue. And so I think that it's naive to think that in these complex adaptive situations, which is our economy, to step in and stimulate, we end up exacerbating the challenges that we're trying to alleviate. And a lot of these challenges arise because of fiscal irresponsibility. They arise because of misaligned or misguided behavior. And if we don't allow the repercussions of that behavior to take place, all of a sudden that behavior can repeat and repeat and repeat, and we're not growing as a society. So that behavior, those repercussions are necessary to allow us to trend towards growth as a society and to actually increase stability in the long term.
So part of this is a bit challenging because you want to do good things. Like you want to buy a Tom's shoe so you can help a kid in Africa, or you want to donate money. And then at the end of the day, you're actually maybe not helping anybody and maybe even worse, doing more harm. So how do you be a good philanthropic citizen and do good things and help people out, but actually help them out in the context in which you're referring to?
So I think it's really interesting when we think about, let's say, our political leanings. We tend to think, well, I'm left, or I'm right, or I'm capitalist, or I'm socialist.
Yeah.
Now, this may be on a grand scale, but even for me as an individual, my opinions change depending on the circle of influence. And so on a grand scale, when I look at nation states, I'm very much pro free markets, reduction of intervention, deregulation. That's me personally. But as I come down into a more community level, I'm very much interventionistic. I go and dedicate a ton of time to local nonprofits. I've set up the Looking Glass Education with a few like-minded individuals for free education. I try to support those around me. I want to give food to the food bank. I want to go and do all of this interventionistic stuff. And I think that is on a small, independent level. I very much support anyone to do those things. The thing is, that is not impacting this big complex system which we are engaged in. And that's where in nature, you do not see things that are too big to fail. You don't get an animal, an elephant that's the size of frickin' 10-story buildings, that if it is to die, it's going to impact the ecosystem around it. We just don't see that. And so the problem that we face with governments, the problem that we face with these immense monopolistic corporations is they become too big to fail. When they're governing these large complex systems, they struggle to understand the unintended consequences of their actions. And so that's where I'm not against intervention. I'm against intervention on a grand scale that leads to a lot of the byproducts which we're experiencing.
So I like to teach people about crypto and have them pay me to do so. You at Looking Glass offer Bitcoin education for free. Aren't you doing the same thing to educators in the sense like you're flooding the market with high quality free education? And I'm like, hey, pay me to teach you. But in reality, they should just go talk to you. Do you know what I mean?
So I think that, and this is kind of Jeff Booth's thesis, is that society is always trending towards kind of growth from the perspective of, if you take, I don't know, a little hunter-gatherer individual, the hunter-gatherer that was able to make use of his environment more efficiently than those around him survived, while those that didn't slowly withered away. And so we trended towards growth. And now we have these amazing buildings, this technology that's around us. We are able to do far more than we were able to do 100, 1,000, 10,000 years ago. And so as technology advances, prices fall. And Jeff Booth talks about this idea that prices fall to the marginal cost of production. So when the iPhone first came out and created the App Store, if you wanted a calculator app, you were probably spending $5 to get the calculator app on your phone. But over time, with competition, prices fall to eventually they're effectively free. And the benefit, even though it may be free, the benefit is you're getting awareness publicly. You're getting benefits that may not necessarily be monetary. And so I think that the point being made is, in a free market, prices slowly trend towards zero in most things, or at least the cost of production. And education, for me, just because I'm offering it for free, that hasn't come back in other forms and actually ended up supporting me monetarily in other ways, opening up job offers, you name it.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. The idea of kind of like the negative psychological effects of our money system on individuals seems like what you're most passionate about when it comes to Bitcoin. I feel like when I ask you a question of like, what negative things happen to individuals in our current money system and how can Bitcoin solve that problem? It seems to me, and I want to hear your thoughts on this. It seems to me that you light up when you get to answer that type of question. It seems to be the area in which you're most passionate about. Is my assessment correct? Or if it's not, what is in the system of Bitcoin that you're most passionate about from a solution problem solving perspective?
I absolutely think that what motivates me, and you're bang on, is more the psychological aspect. Because in the end, like, the most fascinating thing about Bitcoin to me is that it gets us to stop thinking about money. Money is a byproduct of, or thinking about money is a byproduct of broken money. If we're constantly having to think about money, it's because we don't have enough of it. We're just trying to simply survive. And so all of our mental resources are going towards trying to put food on the table, trying to build some form of security in a world that's making it harder and harder to do so. And so I think that if we want to move towards a more prosperous world, we've got to be able to spend more time looking inwards. We've got to spend more time in community. We've got to spend more time reflecting. And I think that that's one of the big challenges that we have today. People are very much misattuned to what their needs are. People are losing intuition. I think that technology has done us immense service in many, many, many different fields. But one field that I think it has done us a disservice is that I think people 500 years ago, 1,000 years ago, were spiritually and internally much more attuned. And we've just slowly lost that because of all of the stimulus. And so that's where I think money, things like Bitcoin, are so fascinating, because all of a sudden it actually allows us to step back and start to reflect on the world around us, bring us more into the present, bring us more into the body, make us more aware. And that, I think, is truly, truly profound.
Yeah, I think you're right about that, because so many of our social challenges are financially related, and a lot comes back to money in how we function in society, how we deal with others, how relationships are built, and you know, how we raise our children as well. Seb, if you ever have kids, what are you going to teach them about Bitcoin?
You know what? And it's definitely not an if, it's a when. I just got to figure it out. Hardest part, I've got to find the partner. That's the
most challenging part.
The first hurdle we've got to get over is finding the partner.
So when you find her and you have a plethora of children and you do truly go forth and multiply, what are you going to teach them about Bitcoin?
I think that, you know what, and this is something that I am very much, my thoughts on it are constantly evolving. And what Bitcoin has taught me is that it's not about intervention. It's not about this active approach to, I want to create change, this active change. I want to start the business. I want to do this. I want to inject capital here. I want to change this person's thoughts. It's much more about this passive change. And it's kind of, when you look at like Taoist philosophy and Lao Tzu, he talks a lot about this thing called Wa Wei. Wa Wei is the art of doing by not doing. And I think this is so fascinating. It's this passive change. Bitcoin creates change because everybody can use it in its own right. Nobody is forcing anyone to use it. No one is printing more money, stimulating the economy, pushing their own views. Everybody is kind of on their own little journey, and that journey is unfolding. And so when it comes to my kids, one thing that I really want to do is allow them to step back and kind of approach life more from this passive perspective of not stepping back and just sitting on the couch, allowing life to unfold, but more pursuing the things that you are passionate about while detaching from the expectation of results or trying to force change, allowing things to kind of unfold in a more natural perspective. And I think it's a slightly more spiritual approach, and it's something that I've been really trying to do in my own life.
I like that. That's great. I find, in talking to my kids, we recently had an election here in the province, and my kids, my oldest son, who's 11, is like, well, who are you going to vote for, and why are you going to vote for them? And really my answer is, well, which is the least interventionist party? Which one is going to cause us the least amount of tension? Who's going to let us live the way we want to live, right? And that idea of moving away from intervention, I think, is so important. And I hope my kids realize that, they are going to make the best decision for their own lives, not the government. And the financial system is not there to help them the way it's currently designed. And we're trying to make an effort to remove the control of others in our lives and make our own decisions independently as much as we can.
Mm-hmm. And what's interesting is, there's a study called the 100 monkey, or it's a theory called the 100 monkey theory, and there's a decent chunk of evidence that supports this, but it's basically, there was a little island, and on that island there was a handful of monkeys, and one monkey figured out, hey, if I wash my food in the water, then I can get the sand off my food, and it's way nicer to eat. A few monkeys recognized, hey, this monkey's doing this, seems to have more enjoyment, so it started washing its food in the water. When it reached a certain capacity of monkeys doing this action, all of a sudden it's almost as if that knowledge became part of the collective unconscious, and monkeys off the island started doing the same behavior. I think that is fascinating. It's this collective unconscious, this collective knowledge. And so I think that when we think about active versus passive change, I think the world around us through social media pushes us to actively engage and create change in society, when in reality, I think we can create change in many different ways. And even by changing our own thought processes, our own knowledge, we can create change by contributing to the collective unconscious. And I think one thing that I do find fascinating about the kind of the whole political view, and this is something that's actually changed quite frequently. I was just in Victoria at this Bitcoin conference called Learning Bitcoin, and I was talking to the founder of a company called Me Premier Bitcoin, this non-profit down in El Salvador that's helping with Bitcoin education. And I asked the founder, his name's John Dennehy, I was like, John, what is your thoughts on voting? And he was just like, you know what? When we vote twice. We vote once for the candidate, and we vote secondly for the system. By simply voting, we're voting for the continuation of the system.
Right.
And for me, I don't agree with the system. I don't think the system serves the populace. And by voting, we're supporting the system. And so this whole idea of the 100 monkey theory is that although me pulling my vote is not, in the grand scheme of things, 30 million Canadians, is it really going to make that much of a difference? Probably not. But on an energetic level, contributing to the collective unconscious that, hey, this is not the world that I want to live in. I want to live in a world that values value creation, that values the free market, that values things like Bitcoin. By pulling my vote, I'm hoping that in the grand scheme of things, it's contributing to this deeper collective unconscious.
So we'll have a Canadian election most certainly in the next year. So you're saying you would not vote in the election, is that right? Are you Canadian?
I'm a Canadian citizen.
Yes.
Yep.
So, I mean, you don't sound like a Canadian, obviously, but I guess we let you in.
I'm feral. I was raised in the wilderness.
So you won't vote for that reason, because you believe the system is broken, and withholding your vote is going to do better than submitting a vote.
Absolutely. And this is where I've really struggled with this decision, because on the one half, I'm kind of like, okay, you know what? Pierre Poilievre is probably the most aligned to the Bitcoin ethos. And should I vote for the person who at least pushes some agenda that leans into Bitcoin? And so on the one half, I'm just like, you know what, maybe I should just go vote for Pierre Poilievre because it's going to help someone. And then on the other half, I'm just like, but I'm contributing to a system that I don't agree with. And I think that it really hit me when I listened to Jeff Booth a few years ago talk about the fact that he was going out day to day and talking the talk about Bitcoin, going to all of these conferences out there, spreading the word about Bitcoin. But he spent 95% of his time in the fiat world working as fiat companies. And when he came to this realization, hey, if I want to advance Bitcoin, I've got to stop directing my energy towards the fiat world and direct my energy towards the Bitcoin world. And so he managed to figure out management and all that kind of stuff so he could step back from the fiat world and direct his time towards the world of Bitcoin. And I think that I view it similarly in the fact that I want to be able to contribute my time towards the world which I want to see. And everyone is different, but maybe if there's enough people that view the world in a similar light, that energy will shift over time, and maybe we'll start to see more of a free market.
So every time you spend $1, are you not contributing to the same system? Are you not just voting for the dollarized system, the fiat system, whenever you spend dollars?
Absolutely. And I think that it's not, we like to...
Oh, I got you.
We like to paint the world as black and white.
Yes.
And we like to say it's either this or it is this. And I think that over time, there'll be things where I would love to be able to live purely on a Bitcoin-based model. And I think there are certain ways where absolutely I can spend Bitcoin and at that same time it gets converted into fiat and someone receives fiat. Or I can find local providers that only accept Bitcoin. So I'm not even contributing to the fiat world like at all. And it's about trying to find in life, weighing up the pros and cons, where can I make the most impact? And I tend to think that through education, writing the books, working for Bitcoin-based companies, and hopefully withdrawing my vote in all of these various areas, I'm contributing to hopefully the world that I want to see. And if others are aligned, then maybe we'll trend towards that world.
I think it's an interesting challenge because I get what you're saying. You know, I would prefer to support businesses that accept Bitcoin. The challenge I have is I don't want to spend my Bitcoin.
Yeah.
And so, you know, some people say, well, then you should go and spend your Bitcoin at the restaurant and then just go buy some more Bitcoin with your dollars. And I get how that makes sense. It's a bit cumbersome, but I get why that makes sense. Sometimes I try to go to businesses that support Bitcoin and use my dollars, but I try to go there because of that. And I'm not sure if that makes a difference, but it's challenging because you kind of feel trapped, right? Like it's really difficult if you're only using Bitcoin. I mean, you can't do very much at this point in our country. And from what I understand, Vancouver has more businesses that accept Bitcoin than any other city in the world. And so if we can't do it here, and that's probably true outside of El Salvador, if we can't do that here, you know, how is anybody in I don't know, where, you know, other places where Bitcoin isn't near as popular as it is here. And so, you know, we feel, I'm calling you out at the same time. I'm saying, I get it. I get why you don't spend Bitcoin everywhere you go.
Well, and I think that there's these two laws called Gresham's law and Thiers' law. And I think these are really interesting. The first one is Gresham's law. And Gresham's law is that when we have legal tender laws, so in Canada, we've got Canadian dollar legal tender laws. We have to use the Canadian dollar. If I want to go to a store and say, hey, you've got to accept Bitcoin, they can be like, no. Whereas if someone says, I only accept Bitcoin, and I go into that store and say, I'm not going to pay Bitcoin, I want to pay Canadian dollars, they legally have to accept Canadian dollars under legal tender laws. Now, when you've got legal tender laws, what ends up happening is people hoard the good money and they spend the bad money. Because if you go into a merchant, that merchant has to accept Canadian dollars, the bad money, while people will hoard the better money because it protects their purchasing power. So over time, we actually trend towards worse and worse and worse forms of money because people are able to spend their bad money. The government has a legal tender law which says that merchants have to accept that money. Whereas in a free market, the opposite is true. And that's Thiers' law. And Thiers' law is that, hey, if I'm a merchant and I can choose which money I want to accept, well, I'm not going to accept the Canadian dollar. I don't want to accept the Canadian dollar because my purchasing power is going to be declining over time. I'd rather accept Bitcoin. So what ends up happening is merchants over time trend towards the better form of money. So if people are spending the better form of money in society and it's circulating, we end up trending towards a more positive money that serves our purpose, preserving purchasing power. And so I think that if we were to remove legal tender laws, a lot more people would be spending Bitcoin. Not only that, I think that because Bitcoin is treated as property at the moment, every single time you sell Bitcoin, you've now got a taxable event. And so you've got this huge barrier for use, which is you've got a taxable event every single time you sell Bitcoin, whether that's a capital loss or a capital gain. You've now got to record that down. You've got to go file your taxes. You've got to disclose all of these various transactions. And so that becomes a massive headache. So the system isn't set up for using Bitcoin from a day-to-day perspective. And that's where I think that for me as an individual, where I can make a difference is being able to educate on why you save in Bitcoin.
Right.
Educate on how can companies start to think about Bitcoin treasuries, and that's what we do at Block Rewards, or how can we start to get companies paying their employees in Bitcoin. Those type of things, focusing on Bitcoin from a savings perspective and not necessarily from a spending perspective. Because on top of that, I very much urge people to spend their fiat, get rid of your fiat if you're saving in Bitcoin.
Yeah, that's good. That's amazing, Seb. I'd like to kind of end with you telling us quickly a little bit about your book and where we can learn more about you online.
For sure. So I ended up, long story short, I have been a mountain bike instructor for over a decade, and I've loved teaching. I like trying to distill down these complex biomechanical movements into their simplest form. And when the pandemic hit, I very much realized as much as I love teaching and educating in the physical body, I also really like to educate around the world around us and how the world, and from my perspective, works and functions. What are all these various puzzle pieces? And so when the pandemic hit and I had more time on my hands, I've always had a passion in the financial markets and intervention, government policy, macroeconomics. And so I started to write. And that writing ultimately led to me releasing my book in December of last year, which is called The Hidden Cost of Money. And that's all about how money weaves its influence into the world around us, how we show up from a psychological level, into our family, the parent-child bond, into our environment, into politics, even things such as authoritarian and totalitarianism and how they arise from broken money. And so this book really was trying to speak to the layperson, the average individual, about these things, because sometimes I don't believe the average person in society truly understands. I don't even truly understand to what depth money impacts how we show up in life. And that's what I really want to try and convey in this book. And it very much speaks to the layperson, removes a lot of the jargon, and makes it kind of digestible. And yeah, if you want to check it out, it's on Amazon. And you can find me on Twitter at just Seb Bunney, SEBBUNNEY. And I'm also on the other various social channels, and I'm pretty useless on them.
That's amazing. Seb, it's been so good to chat with you again. I learned so much from talking with you and hearing your thoughts on some of these complex issues. I appreciate your time.
No, and I really appreciate it, Darren. I think, again, I mentioned at the start, from all of our conversations and from the back and forth through messages, I appreciate how you look at the world. And not only that, I appreciate just how you show up, and hearing that you have bees, you're living in Vancouver, you're being way more self-sovereign. I think it's profound. And so, again, I value you as an individual, and I value the information you contribute to the community.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Seb. I appreciate it.